For decades, 7-Eleven has been one of the most recognizable sights across Canadian cities. Open late, glowing green-orange lights, and those late-night runs for Slurpees and quick snacks. But almost overnight, Canadians woke up to something no one saw coming. Doors locked, shelves empty, signs pulled down, and whispers spreading that the company was preparing to walk away from the country entirely. People rushed online asking the same question: how does a chain this massive suddenly disappear? And most importantly, what aren't they telling us? That wave of panic exploded even further when a furious franchise owner, known publicly only by the last name Carney, spoke out after losing everything in what he described as a corporate blindside. His rant lit up social media, fueling a storm of anger, confusion, and theories about why the nation's most trusted convenience store seemed to be shutting down everywhere at once. But the truth is far stranger and far deeper than anyone realized, because behind the locked doors and sudden closures sits a story that reaches from local neighborhoods all the way to boardrooms in Japan, secret takeover attempts in Canada, and years of pressure building under the surface. And when you start pulling at the threads, the full picture becomes something far bigger than a few stores shutting down. It becomes a wake-up call about the future of retail itself, and it all starts with one quiet announcement that turned into a nationwide shockwave. The panic truly began when reports revealed that 7-Eleven planned to shut down hundreds of stores across North America. At first, people assumed this announcement was just corporate noise, another one of those distant decisions that wouldn't affect everyday life. But then closures started happening in Canadian cities without warning. Customers were met with empty windows, employees were given notices that didn't explain anything, communities suddenly lost late-night food, staple groceries, and what felt like a social hub. What made this even more dramatic were the online posts spreading the claim that every store in Canada was being shut down. Rumors snowballed fast. Some insisted it was a full retreat. Others claimed bankruptcy. A few went as far as suggesting a hidden financial collapse. And because the company stayed mostly silent, the theories only grew. That silence left space for voices like Carney, the franchise owner who had operated multiple stores for years, suddenly cut off with barely any explanation. He accused the company of prioritizing corporate restructuring over people's livelihoods. His frustration resonated with thousands who were already suspicious of the whole situation. But as more information surfaced, a bigger question emerged. Why now? Why would a company this established start shutting down so many locations so suddenly? The answer begins with massive internal changes that have been building for years, and the pressures finally reached their breaking point. But that wasn't the whole story. Even though 7-Eleven is seen as a global giant, the chain has been absorbing hit after hit from multiple angles, and each of these blows chipped away at the foundation of what used to be a predictable business model. First came the sharp rise in operating costs. Between inflation, shipping delays, and skyrocketing rent prices across major Canadian cities, the cost of running a convenience store climbed to historic highs. Profit margins were already thin, but the last few years pushed them to the edge. Then came the collapse of one of their core revenue sources. Tobacco, cigarette sales have been dropping for years, but recently the decline accelerated faster than anyone predicted. And for convenience stores, where cigarettes often drive most foot traffic, that shift was devastating. But it didn't stop there. Consumer habits changed. People weren't walking to the nearest 7-Eleven for meals or snacks the way they used to. Food delivery apps, online grocery orders, and competing chains like Circle K grabbed massive chunks of the market. And with that shift, 7-Eleven struggled to stay relevant. Inside the company, executives were arguing over what direction the chain should take. Some pushed for an even stronger focus on food and drink items. Others argued that the company needed to close down older stores and invest in new formats. And meanwhile, the financial pressure kept climbing. By the time the closures were announced, the company had reached a point where cutting locations wasn't optional. It was a survival strategy. And yet something else was brewing underneath, something that would push 7-Eleven toward decisions far more drastic than many realize. Because the next part of the story involves a takeover attempt that caught the company off guard. While Canadians were trying to understand why their local stores were disappearing, something far more dramatic was happening behind closed doors. A massive Canadian company, Alimentation Couche-Tard, the owners of Circle K, quietly prepared a bid to buy out 7-Eleven's parent company. This wasn't a small offer, it was a full takeover attempt that could have shifted the entire North American convenience store landscape. Circle K versus 7-Eleven has been one of the biggest retail rivalries for decades, and suddenly, one competitor competitor was trying to absorb the other entirely. Inside 7-Eleven's parent company, executives went into crisis mode. Board members clashed over whether to accept the offer, reject it, or prepare for a counter move. Shareholders demanded changes that would make the company look stronger and more profitable. Analysts started dissecting every part of the company's operations, including Canada. And this is where things get interesting, because Canada wasn't performing the way the company hoped. Sales in several regions were declining, costs were rising, competition was intense, and restructuring the Canadian market felt like the easiest way to strengthen the company's financial position before the takeover played out. So while the public believed the closures were random or sudden, the truth is that they were part of a larger defensive strategy. But for franchise owners like Carney, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that their businesses, built over years of sweat and sacrifice, were pulled out from under them without warning, and what happened next would push the controversy over the edge. While employees were still trying to understand why their stores were shutting down, Carney took his frustration straight to social media. In a fiery video that spread faster than anyone expected, he accused the company of abandoning its franchise owners, hiding information, and using the closures to make corporate executives look better for shareholders. He claimed he had been told his stores were under evaluation, but no one informed him that closures were imminent. He insisted that he lost thousands in inventory, payroll, and renovations that suddenly didn't matter, and he wasn't alone. Other franchisees quietly reached out, echoing their own frustrations, though most were afraid to speak publicly. Carney's explosion ignited a firestorm. Customers demanded answers. Local news outlets began digging for details. And still, 7-Eleven stayed mostly silent, a choice that only fueled the narrative that something bigger was happening. Because if a corporation is doing what's best for itself, it usually wants to control the message. Here, though, the silence felt eerie, like something wasn't adding up. And as people dug deeper, they discovered something unexpected. 7-Eleven wasn't just shutting stores. It was changing its entire identity, but that revelation was only the beginning. Most Canadians didn't realize that 7-Eleven had been quietly repositioning itself worldwide. The company wanted to move away from the old image of cheap snacks and late-night junk food. Instead, they were pushing for upscale meal options, fresher food, higher quality coffee, and even expanded private label products. But this shift came at a cost. Older stores weren't compatible with the new model. Many needed expensive renovations or complete rebuilds. Some were in neighborhoods where these upgrades simply didn't make financial sense. And so, instead of pouring money into stores that didn't fit the future vision, the company chose to pull out. This meant shutting down locations that had been around for decades. It meant leaving franchise owners behind, especially those whose stores required the highest upgrades. And it meant prioritizing growth markets over loyal communities. This also meant Canada, despite its strong 7-Eleven culture in cities like Winnipeg and Edmonton, found itself on the wrong side of the cost-benefit equation. But while this strategy might make sense on paper, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Employees who had worked there for years found themselves without jobs. Communities lost vital late-night services. Longtime customers felt abandoned. And that sense of abandonment raised one more question: what happens next? Because these closures weren't the end. They were the start of a massive transformation happening silently in the background. As more stores closed, the consequences spread far beyond the storefronts. Neighborhoods that relied on 7-Eleven as a late-night food source suddenly found themselves without a safe, nearby option. Students, shift workers, and families lost a familiar place they counted on. And with competition like Circle K rising, entire regions began to shift toward new convenience store loyalties. But the impact on employees was even harsher. Some discovered their store was closing only days before the final shift. Others had to pack up inventory without knowing when they'd be paid out. Many franchisees faced personal financial losses, especially those still locked into loans or renovation agreements. Meanwhile, analysts began predicting that these closures could push Canada into a new phase of retail consolidation. As 7-Eleven shrinks, competitors expand. And when that happens, prices shift, customer options shrink, and the corporate landscape becomes more predictable and less fair. Yet beneath the frustration and confusion, one quiet truth remains. The end of these stores marks the end of an era, and for many Canadians, it represents something deeply personal. But the most surprising part of the story is still ahead. Here's the reality almost no one is talking about. These closures aren't a final retreat. They're a blueprint, a glimpse into the future of convenience stores across Canada and across the world. The company isn't collapsing, it's transforming. But that transformation means letting go of the familiar. The neon signs, the late night crowds, the scratch ticket counters, the microwave snacks. Those are fading away as the company prepares for something new. And while the shutdowns might feel sudden, the strategy behind them has been years in the making. The real shock isn't that 7-Eleven closed stores. The real shock is what these closures reveal about where the retail world is heading. Automation, consolidated corporate power, shrinking neighborhood hubs, rising competition, and an economy forcing companies to evolve faster than communities can keep up. And for Canadians watching this unfold, the question isn't why is this happening anymore? It's what disappears next. The uproar over 7-Eleven's sudden closures shows how deeply these stores were woven into everyday life. They weren't just convenience shops, they were part of the rhythm of cities and small towns alike. But as the industry shifts, some businesses will adapt, and others will vanish entirely. 7-Eleven chose to evolve, even if that meant leaving parts of Canada behind. And while that decision might strengthen the corporation, it leaves real people, employees, franchisees like Carney, and communities facing the consequences. And as the dust settles, one truth is becoming impossible to ignore. These shutdowns aren't the end of the story. They're the warning sign that the retail landscape Canadians grew up with is changing fast. And the next headline might be even more shocking.